Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Basma Al-Gussein, and I am the Executive Director of the Middle East Policy Council. We are honored to host our 115th Capitol Hill Conference in the Capitol Visitor Center. Our thanks to all of you who have joined us in person, as well as to many of those who have joined us from around the world online. For our discussion today, we have assembled an outstanding panel of speakers to address the topic, Information and War, a case study in Gaza. Before I turn to today's program, I would like to say a few words about the Middle East Policy Council. The Council was established in 1981 for the purpose of promoting dialogue and education concerning the U.S. and the countries of the Middle East. Among our core programs are, number one, our quarterly Capitol Hill conferences, such as today's event. Two, our quarterly journal, Middle East Policy, which can be found in more than 16,000 libraries worldwide, and our educational outreach program, Teach Mideast, which provides educational resources on the Middle East geared towards secondary students and teachers. We also have several products focused on the informational needs of embassies and Capitol Hill staff. Please visit us on the web at www.mepc.org and our Teach Mideast program at www.teachmideast.org to learn more about our organization and our activities. Concerning today's event, the conference proceedings will be posted on video and transcript from our website, and we will also send a recap of the program around to our mailing list. Now let me turn to today's distinguished panelists. Our first speaker at the end of the table is Mr. Andrew Steinfeld, who has served as a foreign policy advisor for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and held several positions at the U.S. Department of State, including in Kabul, Khartoum, Islamabad, and Tel Aviv. Mr. Steinfeld was formerly the director of the Office of Press and Public Affairs at the State Department's Bureau of Near East Affairs. Speaking after Mr. Steinfeld will be Mr. Dan Arbell, a scholar in residence at American University's Center for Israeli Studies and an associate fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Mr. Arbell previously served in Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs as Deputy Chief of Mission at the Israeli Embassy here in Washington, D.C. He also served as acting head of the North America Division, among other roles. Following Mr. Arbell is the Honorable Miss Nadia Bilbassy-Charters, the Bureau Chief at News Source El Arabiya in Washington, D.C. Miss Bilbassy-Charters previously worked at the Middle East Broadcasting Center, where she held the positions of Chief Correspondent for the Americas, East Africa Bureau Chief, and Correspondent. And finally, we will have Dr. Jamal Nusseibeh, the non-resident scholar at Middle East Policy Council and a Palestinian-American lawyer and investor who will share his analysis. Dr. Nusseibeh is the CEO of Greenwich, Connecticut investment firm and a barrister at law in the United Kingdom. He was formerly a professor at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem, where he was also vice president. He held the Palestine and Law Fellowship at Columbia University, and during his career has been involved in second-track peace negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians. The moderator of today's discussion will be Middle East Policy Council's excellent president, Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley. As you have seen, we have placed an index card on each of the seats. As you have questions, please write them on the index card and hold the card up for our staff to collect and bring to the dais. Please do so during the panelist presentation so that our moderator can review and prepare the questions for the discussion. For those joining us through the video broadcast, please submit your questions through our email address, info@mepc.org. And I would like to politely ask everyone who is present to please silence their phones and anything else that might make noise during today's filming. With that, I am pleased to turn the floor over to our first speaker, Mr. Andrew Steinfeld, to begin his opening statements.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to speak on several issues. One, I'm going to talk about the relationship that I've developed over time, and which I think is an important one, between a Foreign Service officer and the Fourth Estate. Then I'm going to talk about my experience in a war zone, which is generally focused in Kabul, Afghanistan, and the role of the military versus civilians in how the war is discussed and eventually spun. Then to say something relevant about Gaza, which is the main topic today and one we think about all the time. I'm going to talk about, as the consumer of information, how I see the press dealing with Gaza in the United States. So let me start at the beginning. I was a Foreign Service officer for 36 years. I had two jobs involving the press. One, I was the public affairs officer in Islamabad shortly after 9/11. And then I was the office director for the press office of Assistant Secretary Martin Indyk in the State Department in the 90s. My philosophy vis-a-vis what the relationship should be between a Foreign Service officer and the press is one based on the fact that I always thought that as a Foreign Service officer, I was a servant of the American people. They were paying my salary. I wasn't privately working for the U.S. government. And as an avid consumer of the press, I thought it was important that the public have a good sense of really what's going on in the world. For example, I know everything about the Middle East, so when I read an article about the Middle East, I can bring my own evaluation to what I'm reading. When I read an article about China and Taiwan, I expect it to be a well-sourced article because I don't have any of my own personal knowledge about East Asia. So I always enjoyed a very active communication between myself and the press wherever I was. In Tel Aviv, for example, where I served some 30-odd years ago, I had a good relationship with a young Haaretz reporter named Aluf Ben, who has now become the editor-in-chief of that newspaper. And what I found about my relationship with the press is that it was a very useful symbiotic relationship, because insofar as we had everything from confidential to top-secret information spinning in our brains, the press often, particularly in war zones, actually has more access in the field than we do as Foreign Service officers, because we are extremely restricted now, particularly since the disaster that befell Chris Stevens in Libya. Our regional security officers really put a tight hold on us. So the press is all over the place, and we can learn a lot from them, and they can learn from us. So I think that relationship is really important, and I've always enjoyed that. But not all foreign servicers are as open with the press as I've tried to be. Now let me talk a little bit about my experience about military versus civilian spin, for lack of a better word, in my time in Afghanistan. I was in Kabul for 2 years as the deputy senior civilian representative at the NATO office in Kabul, so I was separate from the embassy. NATO had what amounted to an embassy in Kabul, which was NATO's only sort of embassy overseas. So you had your 4-star general, and then you had a very senior British senior civilian rep, and I was the American deputy to that Brit. And just to give you a sense of where it's all coming from, is John Allen, who was then the commander of ISAF, used to say to Simon Gass, his senior civilian rep, he's my 4-star sideman. And Simon would quip, yes, 4 stars made of paper. So that was a bit representative of the fact that in a place like the Afghan war zone, and I got there when there was 150,000 U.S. troops, so it was the halcyon years of U.S. presence in Afghanistan. The power of the narrative came much more, in my mind, from the military than the civilians. John Allen was replaced by Joe Dunford, who then became chairman of the Joint Chiefs. They were in charge of the war. They wore the 8 stars on their shoulders. Sure, we had a very senior ambassador across the way at the U.S. Embassy, but when it came to explaining the war to the Congress, to the press, and just in general, their voices were much more listened to, I believe, than our civilian leaders in the field. And what did that lead to? Well, that, in my mind, led to and I think it's clear the way the war in Afghanistan ended after 20 years, it led to a very skewed view of how America and all of NATO was faring in the war zone of Afghanistan. The military tended to have a constantly rose-colored glasses view of the progress we were making in nation building, in defeating the Taliban, and eliminating al-Qaeda. And I think the proof is in the pudding. That war ended in a way that really requires us to look, as many people have done, at what were all those years of public relations of the generals, and what did they know, and what were they saying, and what was the difference between what they knew and what they were projecting. Let me say a few words about the war in Gaza and how I see the media spin in the United States. I'm long retired, so I'm now a consumer of the media rather than a participant in creating it. And I think one of the things I've noticed is the power of the media to shape the environment of information. And by that I mean is, given our silos now, I refuse to be in a silo. So even though I may be more sort of MSNBC-ish, I do spend part of the day listening to Fox because I think it's really important to get the whole view of what's out there. And I would say when it comes to Gaza, I think the information the American people have gotten has evolved over time. It started off, of course, with a total focus on October 7th and almost a gruesome focus on what happened in the kibbutzim and the tales of the lives lost, which at the time was newsworthy by all news organizations. I think over time something very interesting has happened. I think that if you go from, say, PBS to MSNBC to CNN to Fox, you get a different view of what is actually going on in the war. I was struck last night watching the PBS NewsHour. They had an amazing 5-minute report on some Palestinians who were walking with a white flag. Some of you may have seen it. And then as they were walking to get some people who weren't out of the house yet, one of them was shot and killed. And presumably by the IDF, although the IDF says we don't know what happened, we're looking into it, which is the usual line of the IDF. Interestingly, this morning I saw it on MSNBC. I'm not sure that that kind of reportage will actually make it to Fox. And my point being that since the critique of Israeli excesses in Gaza vis-a-vis sympathy for what happened on October 7th, and we can have in our minds both, I think that the people who watch Fox get a certain view reinforced. It's interesting that Fox viewers who tend to be conservative, and there are a lot of Christian conservatives who watch Fox, today tend to be the biggest supporters of Israel in the United States. And I think, so the media environment shapes the view and then reinforces the view of people, people's views that are preconceived. So let me just finish with a fun vignette just to make it a little lighter. So we are I'm going back to the first thing about what it's like being a Foreign Service officer dealing with the press. We're in the late 1990s. I'm the office director for the press for Martin Indyk, and I'm taking calls all the time from journalists far and wide. And I get a call from an Israeli journalist, a woman Israeli journalist, very aggressive. She definitely was not from Haaretz, Dan. I think she was from either Ma'ariv or Yediot. And she's starting to ask me about something that just transpired in a phone call between the newly elected president, the newly elected Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his first term as Prime Minister from 96 to 99, and Madeleine Albright, who was our Secretary of State. So I say to this journalist, I say, given Bibi's recent behavior, you're lucky that Madeleine took the call at all. So I just say, well, that was a clever line. I get to work the next morning. Martin Indyk calls me to his office. And he said, Andrew, what is this doing in the news in Israel? And he said, you better go up right now and see Jamie Rubin. Jamie was Madeleine's press secretary. And there's a problem on the 7th floor with this line. Fortunately, Jamie Rubin could not have been more gracious. He said, look, Andrew, these things happen all the time. Just be very careful to stipulate if it's on the record or off the record. Usually they'll obey those rules. But I was off the hook. And in retrospect, when I think about it now, I think maybe Secretary Albright was kind of glad that that line actually appeared in the newspaper, because even back then, there were serious issues, even in his first term, between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the State Department. So I'll finish with that and ask Dan to speak now.
Thank you all. It's great to be here with this esteemed panel. Can you hear me in the back? Great. So I served in the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs for 26 years with posts overseas. I'm going to share with you some of my observations about Israel's information policy in general, and then transition pretty quickly to what's going on in Gaza now and how Israel's handling it or mishandling it. Well, depends how you look at it. But just a lesson in Hebrew first. Israel's information policy is known in Hebrew as hasbara. So I'm going to repeat that word hasbara quite a few times. Hasbara in Hebrew means explaining. And so Israel's information policy has always been, since day one, to explain its policies, because apparently they weren't always clear. When Israelis get together for a night out, then one of the first topics that comes out talking about what's going on in the world or the situation is Israel's bad PR. Why isn't the Israeli Hasbara doing enough? Why isn't Israel raising its voice, and so on and so forth? It's a favorite sport of Israelis to moan about their Hasbara efforts or non-efforts. There used to be a Ministry of Hasbara, Ministry of Information in Israel for brief periods of time, but that has been no longer the case. And now all of the functions of information and Hasbara are distributed among the Prime Minister's office, the Foreign Ministry, Defense Ministry, IDF, and other government agencies. And the budget for Hasbara has never been enough, and there's always moaning about that. Israel's late president, Shimon Peres, had this saying, said once, before the age of social media, that you don't need, when you have good policy, you don't need Hasbara. When you have good policy, you don't need to explain yourself. And when he was criticized about it, he said, well, what I meant was that, clarified, and he said that without a policy of peace initiatives, Israel cannot conduct an effective information policy. And it's not enough just to explain. You have to have somebody on the other end that believes your explanation. So for most of my time as a diplomat, I witnessed how almost always Hasbara, information, came in second after policy decisions. And often policy decisions were made and then only then were followed by Hasbara policy, which was tailored to that specific policy decision. Israeli Hasbara was often reactive and slow to react, and often facing sophisticated information campaigns by Israel's opponents. So the first time I encountered how challenging Israel's Hasbara effort is was during the first Intifada between 1987 and 1991. Spontaneous popular uprising that started in Gaza, moved to the West Bank, that caught Israel totally by surprise. And when Israel responded then, and the IDF responded then, the world pretty quickly turned against Israel. The saying goes that television shows but doesn't explain. And here in this case, Israel always struggled with the fact that how do you explain the images of tanks and helicopters attacking Palestinians, hurling rocks or slingshots or Molotov cocktails. And so that was always an issue that Israel had issues to explain. So in general, I'd say that for Israel, the conflict with Palestinians has been an uphill Hasbara information battle, one between an occupying force to an occupied people, one between a party viewed as strong and powerful to a party that's viewed as weak and the underdog. And so in this battle, Palestinians often have the upper hand. But I have to say, I personally believe that the Palestinian issue is not an information challenge that a good argument can defeat. It is a living reality that presents a challenge and at times a threat to Israel's identity and future. Nevertheless, Israel over the years has moved to work on its, to make it more effective, more professional, more initiating Hasbara, or information effort, and we'll talk about that soon. Let me move to Gaza and just mention, in footsteps of what Andrew said, that October 7th, as you all know, is Israel's 9/11. That's how I view it, at least. A national trauma that Israelis are reliving every day. 1,200 dead, thousands wounded, innocent civilians murdered brutally, executed, beheaded, women raped, and civilians abducted. The fact that there's still 136 hostages in the hands of Hamas in Gaza has a huge impact on Israeli public opinion. The war is viewed by a majority of Israelis as a just war that Israel is fighting. A side note that other colleagues of mine will address would be the fact that Israelis are not seeing the images from Gaza so much as the other people around the world, and that's another issue. But again, Israelis are focused on this war and are supporting the war effort. So on October 7th, a second front in the war opened, and this was the front online and a globe-spanning information conflict. This was 3 weeks before Israel launched its ground operation, and Hamas was very effectively and methodologically placing its actions on all platforms, whether Telegram, Facebook Live, TikTok, Hamas's own Gaza Now. You could see the gruesome scenes that Andrew was referring to earlier live or just shortly after, broadcast throughout the world. And that was, besides the fact that it was quite shocking, Hamas realized that it can kill perhaps over 1,000 citizens of Israel, but it can get through social media to 10 million Israelis and to 400 million people around the Middle East, across the Middle East. 3 weeks into the fighting, Hamas's post had trillions of views on social media. So what happened in Israel on October 7th was a systematic failure by the political echelons and the military echelons in Israel. And during the first few days, agencies were practically paralyzed, as Israel's civil society groups and individuals were first to engage in information war, so-called. Israel practically privatized in the early days its information policy to private companies, individuals, and civil society groups that took over and actually were doing what the government was supposed to do but was not doing at the time. Israel invested in the early days also, once it got its act together, millions of dollars in buying ads on social media platforms like YouTube or X. But Israel, again, I refer to what I said in the beginning. Israel is facing a constant challenge, and there's a saying in Hebrew, go prove that you do not have a sister, meaning that what happened on October 17th is a good example when a missile fell on the El Ali hospital in Gaza, killing innocent civilians. Israel, the blaming finger immediately was directed towards Israel. Shortly after that, Israel denied that it fired that missile into the hospital. Only still today, there's no final word on actually who fired that missile. Clearly, it wasn't the IDF that did that, but it's constantly trying to deal with misinformation and disinformation that is Israel's share in this. Early on, Israel's messaging focused on Hamas's ISIS and Hamas, and equating Hamas with the Nazis, and that had some effect. But Israel's war objectives, as defined by the leadership, were defined broadly and not too clearly, and that's an issue also that Israel, Hasbara, faces a challenge. started with eradicating Hamas, then it moved to defeating Hamas, then to incapacitating Hamas. Now it's dismantling Hamas politically and militarily. Which one is it? Which objective is it? When Israeli leaders talk nowadays about total victory or absolute victory, what does that mean? It's very hard and broadly and not clearly defined. In the absence of media representatives of the main media outlets on the ground in Gaza, it gives social media a much greater weight than any time that I can remember before. Social media impacts public opinion, provides intelligence, and impacts, influences military and political decisions. The fact that there's this information that we're talking about, that images from other conflicts are being imported, are decoupled from other conflicts like Ukraine or Syria back in the day to this conflict. And again, you have to prove that this thing has never happened. So this is something that another challenge that Israel is facing is combating the denialism that has started after October 7th. People that are denying that October 7th ever happened. You know, you have these people that deny the Holocaust around the world, but that was 80 years ago. But now still you have this wave of denialism that Israel is facing, and it often is a challenge. Israel did initiate some targeted influence campaigns to weaken and invalidate Hamas's and other claims against its operations. It also undertook a political and legal campaign to pressure social media outlets, companies like Meta, TikTok, X, Google, to remove war-related materials. And out of tens of thousands of requests, a lot of those requests were actually answered by these social media platforms, removing a lot of the content. But again, it's an uphill battle for Israel in this information war, and it's not winning for sure. I'd say that this online conflict, online debate, will continue to shape the course of offline events in the future. They alter public perceptions and often guide official decisions. They are becoming the central to how modern conflicts are fought and won, and we have to prepare ourselves for it in the future. Thank you. I forgot to call upon Nadia, please. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Good morning, everybody. Well, when I was a master's student, one of the books that was an essential reading for all the students was a book titled The First Casualty. It was written by a British author called Philip Knightley. And Philip Knightley quoted a U.S. senator, actually, in 1917. And the senator name was Herman Johnson, and I quote him. He said, "The first casualty when it comes to war is the truth." That was applicable then, applicable now, and always going to be applicable. And I always say at the time of war, whether it is an attack like 9/11, whether it is any kind of attack, whether it's October 7, in a democracy, the most important thing is to stick to values. And it's so easy for people to abandon values. Because what distinguishes you between the others, whether it's a terrorist group, whether it's a militia, whether it is a state that does not share your value, is basically to point to what happened to you, because you abandon your principles. So under no circumstances, and I'm saying it as a journalist, but also as a private citizen, as an American, and as a Palestinian, that we should not abandon our commitment to international law, international humanitarian law, the Fourth Geneva Convention, and all the conventions that authorized and written by the United Nations. Now, regardless of how heinous is the crime, regardless of how horrible is the act, this is what makes a difference between us and the others. So when it comes to Gaza, let's focus on Gaza. And I'm from Gaza, by the way. I grew up in Gaza. When it comes to Gaza, I think it's different than any other conflict. I spent 10 years of my life as a war correspondent. I was in Sri Lanka covering the civil war. I was in Iraq during the invasion. I was based in Nairobi covering Ethiopia-Eritrean war, just name them, literally all the conflict. I was in Rwanda after the genocide. I see Gaza as a completely different case than any other cases that I cover. And it's very simple. I think the Gaza conflict, it does not start on equal footing in the United States. In general, Israel always has the upper hand when it comes to controlling the narrative in the United States. The Palestinians always portrayed as something distant, we don't understand them, Islamist, whatever it is, the label that's been used. But we never start equally as we have people who are occupied and there is an occupier. Now, there's so many things that I was going to talk about, but I'm going to pick up what Dan said. One of the main reasons that people don't get information, and it's vital to get the right information, is when the other side control the information. So what you see now is you see one story, which is the Israeli story. So the Israeli story in American networks, and I used to give lectures about how we should be adhering to all these principles and how we could actually look at the US media, the networks, as our role models. But I actually changed my mind after this, and I'll tell you why. Because you look at the narratives, there is inherent bias in the coverage. Whether they're trying hard not to look biased, but they are biased. And I was watching the news from day one till now. There is a complete bias on how they relate the stories. There is guests that saturated the airways that projected the Israeli point of view. Whether the IDF spokesman that appears on every network, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, just name them. And for every 10 or 20 Israelis that project that point of view, you will have one maybe Palestinian, maybe one Arab, and not even. And that's very important. If you want to balance the story, you have to hear both sides of the story. But the other side of the story is completely censored. And any criticism, it is seen as anti-Semitic, which is a misnomer. It has to be fought in every single avenue and every single opportunity to say criticizing Israel does not equate anybody to be anti-Semitic. It is wrong. It's really wrong to say that. So the fact that we don't have news from Gaza is because Israelis do not allow independent journalists to be in Gaza. So the social media takes but it's not really the social media. It is Palestinian journalists. And guess what? Over 100 Palestinian journalists have been killed till now. Over 100. So when you talk about a Palestinian state, I always wonder, if we talk about the future, who's going to build this state? If the journalists being killed, if the doctors being killed, if the first responders being killed, who's going to build the state? I mean, that's another question. But the fact that we don't have journalists to tell the story, we restrict the access, and if you have a Western journalist, then they go with the IDF from the Israeli side and they tell them what they wanted to tell them. I was embedded with the Marines during the Iraq War. And it's great because you have the illusion that you have access to information, but you don't, because you are under the mercy of what you want you to see and where you're supposed to report, and they give you the illusion that you are free, you can roam whatever, but actually you are in this parameter and you cannot go outside. So you report one point of view, and this is very important. Talking about the social media and Hamas, actually, I mean, I don't know, maybe Hamas has their own channels. I myself, I don't follow them on any of the social media. The things for the American media is, yes, the story of October 7th shaped our conscience. Definitely, any attack on any civilian, one civilian dead, it is bad enough for any news organization to highlight the issue. But the fact that after what happened, and we moved into a whole military campaign, what happened there, it is uncovered and undercovered. There is no stories. It's the story maybe that Andrew just referred to, it's just like a drop in the ocean. We're talking about a complete destruction of a city or a strip like Gaza Strip with 2 million people, worse than Dresden. Just put this in imagination. Why the media doesn't cover that? We're talking about bombs that dropped on Gaza like you haven't seen in modern warfare. Why is not covered? We're talking about 10,000 kids who are going to be orphaned. Maybe more than that number with limbs being amputated. We're talking about 25,000 people dead. The other side of the equation is, when it comes to governing war and misinformation, is you always doubt the other side. They're lying. They're not telling the truth. We don't know. The President of the United States stood up in the beginning of the conflict when the journalists asked him, what about the civilians in Gaza? At the time, they were, I think, about 7,000. And he said, we don't know these numbers. This is Hamas numbers. So if you just throw this without knowing, then you discredit the other side. And it's not, maybe it's Hamas who control the Ministry of Health, but also the Palestinian Authority that go through over these numbers, by the way. And let's assume that there were not 7,000, there were 6,000. Is that good enough for anybody? I mean, the fact that the narrative is being skewed completely in an unfair way, it has to make us re-examine how we look at the media. And do we trust everything that the media puts in the outside for us? And this is why I think people resort to the social media. They look at citizen journalists who put things out. Now, of course, there's so many things that's not true, and it's our job is to make sure that what we see in the public sphere is being double-checked, and facts matters, and it's very, very important. I always say, you know, look at how the media covers the stories and how they use their own description. And we're not supposed, we are journalists, we're not TV anchors, we're not opinion writers, piece writers, whatever. You're not supposed to tell your opinion. I mean, Hamas might be ISIS, Hamas might be committing the most horrible crime, but I don't have to describe it the way it is. That's not my job. That's people, it is there, people can see it. So stick to the facts, and you don't have to describe or use certain words. Second, the way they describe the Palestinians and the Israelis. Israelis were slaughtered, Palestinians died. As if they just dropped dead. They were not killed. Okay. You talk about war crimes, the hypocrisy of the Western media, especially the American media, and including the administration, when they say Russians has committed war crimes because they cut off water, electricity, fuel, and communication on a civilian population. But you say to the spokesman, the White House, the State Department, but this is what the Israelis doing. Isn't that a collective punishment against a civilian? You have every legitimate right to go after Hamas or to defend your country. That's an obligation. That's a moral duty for any democracy, is to defend their citizens. But to overlook a civilian population and a huge violation of international law, and we will see tomorrow, by the way, the ICJ is going to publish its report. We see which way it's going to go. But regardless, I always believe that journalists have the moral high ground to hold officials to account, to hold their feet to the fire, to make sure it's nothing personal here except that to make sure that actually what they say on this conflict is applicable all the time. When you talk about human rights have to apply to everyone. You cannot pick and choose. Otherwise, Russia and China and God knows who, they will say, well, look, the Western world. The hypocrisy of the Western world, it's only applicable when it suits him. And when you tell them certain questions, they said, like, we raised this question. What about this incident? What about the little kid who carried a white flag? We don't know. We refer you to the Israelis. It's just a constant defending of acts that's obvious to everybody else that is wrong, it's morally wrong. It just gets me. And the media repeats and repeats and repeats. Talking about fake news as well. In the beginning, everything was taken as a gospel from the IDF. There is 2 tapes that they published, and both of the tapes were faked. All what you need is an Arabic speakers from Gaza to tell you that the accents were completely off, and the scenario could be written by a high schooler, and it will be even better than that. So the media used it, and they said, well, the IDF proved that, you know, the rocket came from this, there, and I agree with Dan. We don't know who fired the rocket. But what's wrong with an international independent investigation? It might show actually that maybe the other militant groups, maybe Hamas, maybe the Jihad, maybe God knows who, but maybe the Israelis. So you have to hold people accountable. You cannot just dismiss it or repeat it as a gospel truth. And this is what happened. We have seen it all over the American media, from CNN to Fox to MSNBC. They repeat the same line all the time. Anyway. So many things actually we can talk about is how can we control this? How can we make sure that information is correct? First of all, we have to have the intention of actually have factual information. And in this media scope, I think there is an inherited bias, and there is an agenda, and every news media has an agenda. And therefore, it's really hard if you tell some individual journalists take it upon themselves to double-check the facts. And it's very important that, closing remarks, okay, I talk too much, I guess I'm a journalist. All right, but just to finalize, and it even went to 1/5 of what I wrote. The bottom line is it's very, very important for editors, for news organizations to fact-check, to make sure that the sources are correct, to seek independent point of views, and it's not just to rely on one source. Government, lie. Militias, lie. Terrorist organization, lie. Everybody has an agenda, so don't take any sides as a gospel truth and put it on TV without, or publish it in a newspaper without verification. Thank you.
Thanks, Nadia. Thank you, everyone. Hard acts to follow, and I'm the last speaker. I hope I can keep you all awake. Stick with me till the end, please. I promise you it'll be fun. We talk about the fog of war, and that has never been truer than in Gaza today. An assault in which the equivalent of 2 Hiroshimas have been unleashed on a population of 2.2 million people besieged in a tiny enclave on the Mediterranean shores. And yet, there's not a single international journalist there to cover the story. Paradoxically, we have more images and videos of the incredible suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza than in any other conflict, shared and reshared on social media around the world. In this short talk, I'll first briefly explain why this is the case, and some have already talked about that a little, how Israel controls the information about what's happening in Gaza, both in breach of international law and of the basic tenets of democracy. Then I'll discuss how this impacts everybody's understanding of what's happening, and how that impacts also the ability, therefore, to take good decisions, both in the United States and in Israel. And at the very end, I'll make a few suggestions about the implications of this going forward and how we might better address things from a policy perspective. So, Gaza has been blockaded by Israel for almost 2 decades. Since Israel began its attack on Gaza, no international journalist has been able to enter unless embedded with the Israeli military, as mentioned also by Nadia. American and European media outlets are therefore severely restricted in their access to information and cannot provide proper coverage of the war and its toll. Reports on the numbers of dead or wounded are always prefaced by the words, according to the Hamas-run Ministry of Health. And once again, Nadia referred to how President Biden had to qualify his comment on the number of dead by saying he didn't know for that reason. Now, how does Israel do this? What's the alternative? Well, the alternative is our local journalists present in Gaza. But those local journalists have been targeted by Israel, which in the last 3 months has murdered, I had 83 journalists, but there may be more already. It's wounded countless others, threatened and assaulted many more, and imprisoned them. It's destroyed offices and equipment. And this, by the way, my numbers are according to the Committee for the Protection of Journalists. This is not a new policy. Israel has often targeted journalists in the past. I'm going to say a few things that may surprise you here. I don't know, but bear with me. You hopefully will recall the killing of the prominent American Palestinian journalist, friend Shireen Abu Akleh, who was shot in the head by an Israeli sniper while wearing full protective gear, clearly marked with press, on the West Bank in 2021. But the scale of the killings now in Gaza is astronomical. I don't know if you've heard the story of Wael al-Dahdouh. He's the principal face of Al Jazeera now in the area. I mean, it's heartbreaking. I'm going to quickly just mention. So first, The Israelis killed his wife, his 7-year-old daughter, and his 15-year-old son in an airstrike at the end of October on a refugee camp. On the 15th of December, he was covering a strike in Khan Yunis. The strike killed his cameraman and wounded him. He kept on reporting all the way through. I don't know how. And then on the 7th of January, his son, 27-year-old Hamza, who was also a journalist, was killed when he was sitting in his car by, again, a targeted Israeli missile. I have enormous respect for journalists. The policy of killing those who try to tell the story also extends to citizen journalists. And the story that I believe Andrew mentioned that we saw on ITV News a couple of days ago, in which a gentleman who gave an interview, who was seen giving an interview, and then walks off under a white flag, is clearly targeted and shot by the Israeli army. Now, this should be obvious. I'm going to say it anyway. It's not only profoundly barbaric and immoral, it's also blatantly in violation of international law. The specific protection of journalists is set out in the 1977 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions of 1949. It was also reaffirmed by the United Nations Security Council in a resolution of 2006, resolution number 1738. It may surprise you that Israel didn't sign the additional protocols, but actually in legal terms that is irrelevant because they're part of customary international law and therefore they apply anyway. But what might surprise you more, and this is important, is to know that Israel, often described as the only democracy in the Middle East, has a censor office that supervises and controls all journalists operating in Israel and the occupied territories, and that all foreign journalists are required to submit to the censor in order to be accredited in the country. Now, there was an article, I don't know if you saw yesterday in the LA Times, which talked about Israel's tight control of the media coverage of the war in Gaza. That coverage is more or less entirely limited in Israel to images of Israeli soldiers storming buildings or riding triumphantly on tanks. There's an almost complete absence of the civilian toll and of the effect of Israeli bombs and bullets. In fact, it says, according to Times, it said this was partly due to an unprecedented government campaign to stifle critiques of the conflict. And then finally in Israel, and this is even more surprising, at least it's extraordinary, it may not be surprising, they passed a law in November which criminalizes even the passive reception of social media images or videos from Gaza with penalties of up to a year in jail, a law which the Association for Civil Rights in Israel decried as having no precedent in democratic countries. Now, ladies and gentlemen, since we're in Washington, I think it's not a bad place to remember the adage, democracy dies in darkness. So what does this do? It basically means that depending on the source of your information, you have a different view of the same situation. On the one hand, the establishment, US administration, for instance, which receives a sanitized and curated set of facts which support an Israeli narrative of successful precision bombing of terrorist targets, and other information which contradicts this narrative is not given the same weight or credibility, despite it being both pretty abundant and quite verifiable. Meanwhile, a large section of the world population is receiving an unprecedented amount of information, images, videos, so on, which are generated on cell phones, mainly by ordinary people, of incredible human suffering and pain, inflicted deliberately and indiscriminately on an entire population at a scale never seen, at least never seen so clearly before. This has led to a level of outrage which is shared across swaths of the voting population in the US, activists, Arab Americans, Jewish groups that are disgusted by what Israel is doing in their name, and also across the rest of the world. And I don't need to tell you how the Arab nations and the Arab peoples are seething with anger as they watch Israel massacring Palestinians with impunity, and then they see the United States standing shoulder to shoulder, beside and behind. So what does this do? How does it impact our decision-making? Well, without a good understanding of the situation, we cannot take good decisions. And this discord in the understanding of what's happening in Gaza, is it a genocide? Is a direct result of Israel's long-standing policy of limiting and controlling information, even by killing journalists and censoring speech. It is absolutely clear that well over 26,000 people have been killed by Israel in Gaza thus far, of which the majority are women and children. Many more are buried under the rubble. 2 to 3 times that many have been maimed and wounded. It is equally clear that about 80% of the buildings in Gaza, including hospitals, schools, universities, United Nations facilities, and even just normal people's homes, have been destroyed or damaged. And we know this because we can compare satellite images before and after. Finally, it is also clear that Israel is preventing water, food, medicines, and basic supplies from reaching the millions of civilians in Gaza who are slowly starving and beginning to die of preventable disease. These are facts, even if they're not constantly being covered in audiovisual detail on CNN or Fox News. So as the US attempts to formulate policy in response to this, based on this curated view of the facts, it cannot address the issues. The policy proposals that have been suggested thus far by the administration have basically found no traction in the region. And the decision to blindly support this Israeli government in its military escapade is doing immense damage to the standing, to the interests, and in the end to the security of the United States in the region and around the world. The US is rapidly becoming an enemy of the Arabs, and the Houthis may be a small group, but there are millions of Yemenis demonstrating in Sana'a against the Israelis, and now they're demonstrating against the Americans too. Equally, I'll just mention this, the administration is losing voting groups in the United States that helped bring President Biden to power, including the Arab Americans and the activists. Now, in Israel, this draconian control of the media and the narrative on Gaza means that the Israeli people are unable to formulate an informed opinion on their government's actions. Polls show that 75–80% of the Israeli public supports the war, but without access to the facts, whether it be the immense civilian casualties and devastation, or even an understanding about whether Israel is winning or losing the war, or what the consequences for Israel will be, like is it international exclusion from the club of civilized nations? What's it going to be? How can the Israeli public be expected to exercise its democratic choice? Again, democracy dies in darkness. To conclude, there are many, many things about the war in Gaza that are deeply wrong, morally, and legally. The Israeli government's attempt to impose a blackout on and control all the information about Gaza and to target anyone who attempts to tell the story of what's happening should be called out and rejected by everyone, especially, first and foremost, the United States. International journalists must be allowed to enter Gaza and cover the conflict, and all journalists, in fact, all civilians, must be protected and kept safe. Now, in the bigger picture, it is time for the US to stop dithering and take Netanyahu's government to task for having abandoned the principles which Israel and the United States claim to stand for. Let's be clear, these are not the actions of a civilized country. They cannot be accepted and condoned. It is absolutely essential and urgent to use existing American laws over here to control the flow and use of US armaments by Israel in its indiscriminate war on Gaza, and to withhold aid to an Israeli government that seems bent on taking Israel and the entire region, and the United States with it, into a prolonged and messy war. It is also time to provide protection for civilians in this ongoing conflict. All of them, Palestinians and Israelis. Look, Israel's security paradigm has blatantly failed to protect Israeli civilians. We've seen that on October 7. Palestinians are clearly incapable of protecting themselves. It is time for a peacekeeping force to step in to the occupied territories, to ensure a ceasefire and to the release of hostages, to get immediate humanitarian aid and assistance to the people in Gaza before they die of famine and disease, and to allow for elections to take place, both in the state of Israel and in a new state of Palestine, which should be recognized by the United States now. It is time. Thank you.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone, and You've put a lot out there for what I describe as a juicy conversation for us all. There's a lot of really good information out there. I want to remind everyone to please use the note cards that are on your chairs to write down questions and pass them forward. Sarah will be walking around the room to collect them. I know there are a lot of questions for our panelists. So I'm going to start with something that we have all been vexed with since October 7th, which is artificially intelligence-generated images of children, of civilians, of soldiers, and they're circulated as being real, and then photographs of things that have really happened being tagged as false. So I'd like to start with Mr. Steinfeld and Mr. Arbell, if you'd like to comment as well. What are the challenges for governments to police or respond to false information?
I'm not sure, given the prevalence of social media in all of its massiveness, I've actually become quite skeptical of controlling disinformation. I think the answer is an educated public that, I think of, for example, when parents complain about their kids, what's on TikTok, what's on Facebook, what's on this. I think we're past the point where these social media things can actually be controlled. I think we need an educated public who tries to figure out what's right and what's not right. Let me just make another comment that I wanted to make about our two participants to the left. On the question of information, we can talk about this more later. I don't really think the issue is that the information is not getting to the United States population. I think the reaction of young Jews, the reaction of Arab Americans in Michigan, I think that shows that it's in fact all getting through. Americans know what's going on. The question is, what are the politics of the issue? And the U.S.-Israeli relationship hangs over this war like a monster in the sense of finding some balance. So your comments motivated me to say that.
And I ask all the panelists to feel free to respond to each other as we go along here. This is a discussion. Okay, thank you. Dan, do you want to add anything to that? Or?
I'm not an artificial intelligence expert, but I do think that I agree with Andrew that it's very hard to control, and I think that legislation is being looked at as we speak in different countries, but I think it mostly has a chance to succeed in places like Russia or China or non-democratic regimes or Turkey, not really in where democracies are. There are many accusations been leveled here against Israel. I'm not an official representative of the State of Israel anymore. I'm not on their payroll anymore, so I'm not. But there has been really a sense of we talk about democracy dies in the dark. Really, Hamas is a democracy. Hamas would have allowed journalists to roam freely in Gaza. Hamas is anything but a democracy. It's the exact opposite, and it's a totalitarian regime. It is a regime that silences its critics. It controls very much media reporting during days of when there's no war. Thinking that Hamas would actually allow free coverage and basic coverage I think is pretty much a long shot. And I do see that Israel does have a lot of challenges in explaining what it's doing. But again, it's very cumbersome if Israel attacks God forbid, a hospital. Who attacks a hospital? But how do you then? You have to explain that in the hospital, it's a headquarters for Hamas, where they hide, where in the operating rooms or in the clinics, they hide weapons, and the Hamas activists and terrorists are inside the hospital. So, of course, you have to go after them and attack them, and then, obviously, it looks bad. But it's, if you want to uproot the Hamas or remove Hamas from the equation, it doesn't look pretty, but you have to do it. So there are many other aspects to it. Again, I'm not an official spokesman, but I just wanted to refer to some of the issues that were raised, and we'd be happy to answer other questions later.
Thanks, Dan. I know, Nadia, you probably want to pull up the points you were making earlier.
Yeah, just quickly, I know there's so many questions, but I think that nobody defends Hamas. Nobody said Hamas is a responsible government or they allow the freedom of expression and all of that. Actually, I was on a committee called the International Women Media Foundation. We awarded a young Palestinian writer, an incredible writer, an award that helps her to get asylum in France because of harassment of Hamas. So nobody defends Hamas here. The whole question is targeting Palestinian journalists. And American journalists, Palestinian journalists like Shireen Abu Akleh, till now, we don't know. And we know that very well that it was an Israeli sniper. There was no responsibility. Nobody admit the responsibility for her. So the question is not just taking Hamas side. I think the whole public is outraged at the disproportionate response from the Israelis. And it's very easy to say that Hamas is putting kids in harm's way and civilians because they put weapons in schools and in hospitals, whatever. But it is the responsibility of a state. Gaza is occupied under international law. Gaza is an occupied land, the same with the West Bank, and it is the responsibility of the occupying power under the Geneva Convention is to protect civilian population. There's a gross violation of international law here when it comes to civilian. And I said that in the beginning, no matter of how bad is the crime, and we understand that very well. And I could have friends on the other side who've been killed on October 7. We understand that it's not the lack of sympathy, but it's accountability of how do you go after the people who perpetrate an attack during a very, very hard time to protect civilians.
Nadia?
So, just one last thing.
Okay.
One last thing. Hamas is designated by the United States as a terrorist organization. So when it suits some people, sometimes they say, well, it's a government in Gaza. And they deal with it as if it's Switzerland. And sometimes they said, well, it's a terrorist. So you have to decide where Hamas stands. We're talking about civilian and protection of journalists, covering the journalists and misinformation.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask you to follow up on a very specific question, which is, can you share with us what sort of efforts or what sort of things reporters, journalists do to vet information before they share it further? Knowing so much disinformation is out there, that there are constrained sources of information, et cetera, how do journalists navigate that? Yes, what are the sorts of things to verify the information or to work around controls?
I started as a young reporter with AFP, Agence France Presse, in Gaza, in the first Intifada in '87. And the first thing you learn is the most important thing is the ABCs of journalism, is you have to verify the story from multiple sources. So when you're there, somebody will come and tell you, they give you a lead, and you think, well, this is great, I'm going to have an exclusive. You have to double check it from multiple sources, 1, 2, 3, 4, to make sure it's credible. Don't accept what people tell you, because it's very easy. As I said, people have motivation. They leak information even in a democracy for a purpose. So you don't fall for the information that's given to you easily. So you have to make sure that the information is verifiable. And be an eyewitness. It's very important to give training to journalists, to understand the background, to understand the culture, and to understand the history. Now we have a conflict like now in Gaza. Nobody understands the history. Nobody goes to the Zionist movement. Nobody goes 100 years back. They just go to a week ago or 2 weeks ago. And so easy in the world of fast information is to go to the soundbite instead of a historical understanding of grievances, of international law, of where we stand now, etc. So this is vital for journalists. It's just, you cannot just be, following a quick soundbite. You have to deeply commit to be a truth teller. And it's hard because we all have inherent biases, but you have to shed your bias and trying to put yourself in the other side's shoes, in the point of view to hear it from the different perspectives.
Thank you. Mr. Nusseibeh, is it legal for governments to intentionally share false information?
Good question.
I thought governments always share false information.
As a former government official, I would never admit to that, but please.
I'm not sure that there's a specific answer under international law, if that's the answer we're looking for. But I think that perhaps what's more important is what the purpose of that false information is and how that is designed to create reactions or actions that are misleading. And in this case, Nadia's also spoken about this, I mentioned it a little. It is extremely hard to verify the information that is coming out of Gaza from, on cell phones. I don't know. I receive tons of this on WhatsApp, and God, I don't have TikTok, thank God. But you look at these videos, I don't know whether they're real or not. But I know that they're the only place, this form of media is the only place that I'm going to get this information. Now, what I need is what Nadia was talking about, verified, serious, credible journalists to go in there so that I know that when I'm seeing these videos of houses and hospitals being blown up, that they are actually real videos of what really happened. In the case of Gaza, I think we've seen it. It's relatively verifiable just from the air, but it's up.
Yeah, thank you. This question I'm taking from the audience now. I have 7 more of my own, but anyway. Dan, did October 7, this attack, this heinous attack, convince a majority of Israelis that the only way Israel can enjoy long-term peace and security is to resolve the Palestinian issue, one way or the other?
It's a great question. As Jamal said earlier, there's a fog of war, and the war is continuing, and it's far from over. And it's very, very hard while we're still in this mode of war to look at the day after and see how this will impact the Israeli population. Clearly, emotions run high now in Israel, and people want to see Hamas punished for what it did, want to see the hostages return safely to their homes in Israel. They want to see Hamas out of the equation, and so they are supporting the war effort. But I think as people are not very cool-headed at this point, as war goes on and there are casualties every day, and stories of the hostages and their families and their plight is also dominating the media coverage. So it's very hard to say how this war at the end will turn out in terms of Israeli politics. Whether it will, right now I would say it is convincing many people. Has turned many people more to the right, actually, support a tougher approach on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to oppose a Palestinian state, not to let any. Now's no time for diplomacy. The two-state solution is it's a repetition of Oslo and so on and so forth. But I think that that's kind of right now how emotions and sentiments are. But I think that once the war is over, and after sort of an interim period, I do think that I'm an optimist, and I do believe that the two-state solution is the only option. And I do think that there will be a time later, though, to return to diplomacy and to return to advancing the two-state solution.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to ask you all to keep your answers tight because I have a lot of questions to get through. Jamal, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, if I might. I think that the only time to make peace is when you're in the middle of a war. You can't wait for the war to end and then start thinking about making peace. And in this case, the only way that the war is going to stop is if we make peace. There's no other alternative. And since more or less everybody agrees that the simplest alternative is a two-state solution, it may not be the best alternative, but it's the best available alternative before us right now, then the only thing that makes sense is for us to do that now, and to do it ideally together, but if not, then to have somebody else help us along. This is what I think. And the reason that I also think this is because, and this is my second point, Hamas, as Nadia was mentioning, what is Hamas? And what is it that we're trying to eradicate, or you're trying to eradicate in this case, in Gaza? From our perspective, from a Palestinian perspective, this isn't a war on Hamas. This is a war on people. And Hamas is just a political party which happens to have an armed wing, which has been in control of a besieged strip for a very long time. It hasn't been elected for a very long time, as far as I'm,
was elected once and never allowed election.
Exactly. And it has not been popular, even in the strip. It was not a popular party on October 6th, and probably would not have won elections even in Gaza had it run for re-election. So,
Okay. Thank you. All right, I want each of you to respond to this one again tight, and I will take the privilege of the chair to interrupt you if you are not tight. What are your expectations for the ICJ ruling taking place tomorrow? And I'd like you to address how this will shift or not the information influence operations of the war. Starting with you, Andrew.
I think my understanding is going to be some preliminary decision. My guess is that it will be a strong wrist slap against Israel. I think that in the end, the game at play is really, and I have a lot of thoughts about this, the real game for me is between the United States and Israel, and I don't think it will affect that in any way.
Okay. Dan.
With a panel of judges that from China, Russia, Somalia, Lebanon, and the other third world countries on the panel, I don't really expect any.
Did you say third world, Dan?
I did say. Is that, okay. Is that bad?
Yes.
Okay. I don't expect any favorable resolution decision in favor of Israel. God forbid. I do think that it would be, as Andrew said, they won't issue a decision, an opinion that there's genocidal activities, but I think that they will be calling on Israel to exercise restraint and to actually and make kind of if I take a term from football, soccer, I guess, a yellow card to Israel, not a red card at this point. But I don't think that this will be the end of it.
Okay, got it. Yellow card. Nadia?
I don't know if it's going to be a definitive ruling in terms of a clear-cut genocide.
No, it is not expected to be. That's not what they're doing. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's going to be, they're going to reprimand Israel. They're going to hold it accountable to all the violation under Article 52. I think they are in violation of A1, A2, A1, and I can't remember them, and B2 and BD and something like this. It's the number of the articles that have been violated. What's interesting about the case is South Africa brought the case against Israel, and South Africa, with its struggle against apartheid, very often the analogy between Israel and South Africa is held. Of course, Israel rejects that, but on the ground, if you actually live in the West Bank or Gaza, you can see similarities in terms of applying a system that is very analogous to the apartheid system. If you also look at, very interesting, the people who, with and against, you can see the one who's against that, which is Israel, United States, France, Germany, and the one with it is all the global south, or the third world countries, as Dan referenced them.
Okay.
So it is two cases, and you can make up your mind to what it means.
Jamal.
So I'm not sure what will happen tomorrow with the provisional measures, but I think that it's extremely important to uphold and maintain these international institutions. I think that even from an Israeli perspective, if I were Israeli, I would want to protect these institutions that were set up initially to protect my own people or to protect things from happening again to the Jewish people after the Second World War. I mean, that's the basis on which all of this came. So I'm saddened by the fact that there's so much, that they're being undermined. I won't comment on the fact that third world judges apparently are less good than others, but there are a lot of decent judges around the world. They're not all. I mean, the world is larger than just the United States and Israel. And to Andrew's point, the world is larger than the United States and Israel. I mean, there are many other, and I'm not talking about only Russia and China, but there's more to it. And really, unless we go back to the principles, fairness, justice, equality, and the basic principles that, again, we stand for here in the United States, I don't know how we're going to be able to live, or our children are going to be able to live happily.
The question, which none of you touched on, the bottom half of that question was the impact on the information war and how this is spun, to use Andrew's words from your opening remarks, sir. The spin, from what you said, Andrew, is that Israel and the United States say that there's no there, that it was an unfair criticism of Israel because we're not expecting a final, should they have a ceasefire, should they cease and desist with how they are conducting the war. Yes?
No, I mean, what I would say is that if there is a decision tomorrow that is very critical of Israel, and if it's well argued and well sourced, then I think it will increase the debate in the United States.
Okay.
And to your point, I wasn't in any way saying that the United States is the only country, but when it comes to who's going to try and end this war, and with the calling of, which I don't believe in anymore, but all of you seem to still believe in a two-state solution. I've given up on that. But if there's one country that's going to help it along or push it or press it, it's the United States. My point is, if there's a strong decision tomorrow, it's going to increase. Let's just posit now there's a debate between Biden and Bernie Sanders, Bernie being very tough on it's time to cut things off. I think with each passing day, the power of the Bernies will increase over the powers of the Bidens. And so the discussion within the administration and within the Senate is going to grow larger rather than smaller.
Okay. There's a question for you, Dan, that talked about the Israeli citizens not seeing what's happening in Gaza, that what's on Israeli televisions is often the IDF activity. This is a hypothetical, but that is if there was more than the Israeli narrative being seen, and I question myself, are they not watching CNN International and BBC like the rest of us? But do you think that would have an impact in changing Israeli perspective if they actually were watching what the rest of us are watching? And how there's a lot of discussion in international media about the difference between prosecuting the war for the benefit of the state of Israel versus prosecuting the war for the benefit of the Prime Minister of Israel. And that discussion is out there as well.
So first of all, I want to say something about the ICJ and say that, obviously, sorry, Nadia, that I'm using the word, but I think it's an anti-Semitic display by South Africa as an arm of Hamas to bring Israel to the ICJ. It's preposterous, and it's really something that I don't think will impact at least Israeli positions when it comes to the ruling of the court, the opinions of the court. It's the fact that Assad, Syria weren't brought to the ICJ, and other murderous dictators, yet Israel in a self-defense war is brought to the ICJ. And so I'm going to don't have high expectations from the ICJ, but I just wanted to put that in perspective. As for the TV networks, I have to say that Jamal spoke about military censorship, and there is military censorship, but what we noticed right after the war started is that Israeli TV networks on their own exercised an inward censorship on their own. They all rallied around the flag, and they're have decided, made editors or producers decisions not to show those images, just like they don't show those videos, films that Hamas releases of the hostages, in order to not bring down morale and also not to play into Hamas's psychological warfare. So that's also part of the calculation of why not show what's going on. But I do think that, like you said, Gina, Israelis do watch CNN and other international networks, and some of them do actually know what's going on. If Israeli TV would have been reporting more about the devastation and the deaths in Gaza, I do believe it would have impacted other Israelis, more Israelis, to kind of be more sympathetic and perhaps support an end of the war. I don't have it mathematically, again, the numbers of how many people would impact, but it would definitely have some impact, not necessarily overwhelming, but some impact. As to the war being fought, clearly it's no secret that there are a lot of political divides in the Israeli leadership, and there's a lot of criticism of Prime Minister Netanyahu of his handling of this whole, since October 7th and nowadays. And obviously, at a certain point in time, again, I don't know if there's clearly polls show that 70 to 80% of Israelis want him out, either right away or at the end of the war. So I don't think that he will have much of a future, political future ahead once this war is over.
Okay.
Just very quickly.
Yes.
You said that South Africa is the arm of Hamas. Acting as an arm of Hamas. But as far as I'm concerned, the ICJ case is not Hamas versus Israel. It is Israel versus a violation of international law and the protection and the abdication of their responsibility of protecting civilians. That's what the case is all about. It's nothing to do with Hamas. It's very easy to just throw Hamas when it's convenient. Anyway, the other thing quickly I want to say is I will refer you to one of my favorite Israeli writers, whose name is Gideon Levy. He actually was interviewed recently about this very issue, is why the Israelis are not watching what's happening in Gaza. And he was appalled. He said, like, I understand in Russia, where it's just journalists risk their lives if they tell people what's happening in Ukraine. But in Israel, they didn't. So I think the only explanation is the Israeli society has shifted to the right over the years so much that they don't care anymore about what happened in Gaza. It's in a way they see it as a collective punishment, and I'm just generalizing. But I think this is the case now. It's just like they deserve it. They elected Hamas, then they deserve what happened to them.
Yeah.
And this is how they see it.
Okay. Quick question. Dan, where can we find out more information about how the Israeli Censor's Office works? Is there public information or?
Yeah, the Censor's Office is a government bureau. It's they have a website.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. You can,
Okay. All right. There was a question from the audience. Excellent. How can citizens help or have an impact if there is indeed a bias in how media is portraying the conflict? How do citizens deal with that? How is our voice able to help shift what we are getting from media?
Don't let them get away with it. Bombard them with complaints, write letters to the editors, follow them on Twitter, correct the information, refer them to facts when they misleading the public. There's so many ways that citizens can hold not just government, but media into account. And it's vital in a democracy. It's very, very, very important for every citizen to practice their right and to make sure that the information, that it has to be a quality information.
Okay.
Because without that, you will lose democracy.
Thank you. For Mr. Steinfeld, Andrew, to what extent, in your view, does a presidential election in the United States lower its ability to use its infamous leverage to help bring about a cessation of this conflict?
You're really provoking me with that one.
Someone from the audience.
Look, it looks like we're facing a Biden-Trump campaign. Mr. Biden is under increasing pressure to do something, whatever that something is, I'm not exactly sure, but to somehow put more pressure on Israel, which we've not been very good at in the last 75 years, I don't think Trump has said much about Gaza, but certainly Trump's base these days is a kind of Christian nationalist base, which for interesting reasons, which would make another nice seminar, has swung to be probably one of the most pro-Israeli parties in the United States, much more so than progressive Jews, for example. So I don't see, frankly, I don't see a lot of room this year for President Biden to sit heavily on Israel. One could argue that it might rescue some youth votes, some Arab American votes in Michigan, but I think the view would be that the risks to Biden generally for taking on Israel in any heavy-handed sort of manner would be a negative for him politically. That's just my guess at the moment.
Okay. Jamal, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I disagree. I mean, I think that unless Biden does something clear and different to what he's been doing recently, then he will lose. But the only way that he's going to win is if he does something positive and forceful in the Middle East, not just following the same old policy. And I believe he can take on the Israeli government without taking on Israel, still supporting Israel as Israel's best friend. But there is a massive distinction, and we've already raised it here, between the government of Israel as it is today and what Israel is or was or should be. And the Israel that is a friend of the United States, which may be an eternal friend of the United States, is not the Israel of Netanyahu. And I think it's really high time that he got up and said that. And if he doesn't do that, then he's going to lose the election. And I think it will be much worse for the United States in the region as well.
A riposte, or I'll move on?
Yeah. Quick response. I'm not. The distinction between Netanyahu and the rest of his country, I'm not sure I could 100% agree with. I mean, he has been elected, as I was pointing out to some of you. When I arrived in Israel in 1992, Labor plus Meretz, which was to the left of Labor, got 56 votes in the Knesset. That Israel is
Out of how many? Wait.
Out of 120, so almost a majority, which is 61.
And they have four today.
That Israel doesn't exist anymore. Israel has moved way to the right, and I don't know if there's a constituency in Israel for Biden to get tough with the Israeli prime minister.
Okay. We have to wrap this up. This was a great discussion. I really want to please join me in thanking all of our panelists for their thoughts and comments and shared knowledge with us. It was really awesome. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll look for you at our next Capitol Hill conference. Thank you.